To prepare your paper for our watercolor technique practice, we are going to put some tape around the outside edges, and then we are going to split up our paper into 6 different squares or rectangles. So we're going to put a piece of tape horizontally across the middle, and then we're going to put 2 more pieces of tape vertically down from top to bottom. So it's okay if all 6 of your boxes are not exactly the same. Just make them as close as you can, just by estimating where the tape is going to go. The other thing is you want to leave the ends a little bit loose, because when this dries, you can peel the tape off and it'll give you a nice clean edge, and then you can cut out these squares and put them in your sketchbook to use as a reference. Before you start painting, you want to make sure that your paint is ready. You should have a clean cup of water and a paper towel handy also. So before I start painting, I'm just going to take a couple of drops of water and put that into the well that I'm going to be using. So my palette is going to look different than yours. This is my paint palette at home. So I'm not going to use all of these colors today. I'm just going to put some paint into the colors that I am using. And this will just help the paint get ready, and I'm using clean water so that when I add water later, it's not going to make the colors muddy looking or mix up some of the colors that I'm using. The other thing I want to point out before we start painting is the 2 different types of paintbrushes. So this paintbrush has a flat tip. This is a flat brush, and then this paintbrush is called a round brush because it's obviously more round than the other. So this brush comes to a point at the end, and this one is flat at the end. So there are certain techniques that one brush will work better than the other, and some techniques it doesn't matter which brush you use. So you can try both ways with each technique. Just keep in mind that each brush will look a little bit different when you use it, and it will affect how the technique appears, sometimes depending on the brush. In the first box, we are going to do a wash. A wash is when you load your brush with plenty of wet paint, and then you smooth your brush over the paper with left to right strokes or up and down, but you're going in the same direction. So I'm going to use some red for this technique, and when I'm using my palette, I'm putting a lot of paint and water on my brush, and I'm just gonna go from left to right. Now when I start to brush down, do you see how it's very dry looking? That's when I know I need to get some more water on my brush, load up my brush again with plenty of paint, and start going left to right again. Now with a wash, I want my color to be very rich at the beginning, and then I'm going to fade it as I move down. So I can even start to add just water to my brush and continue to go left to right, and I can still pull enough color down. If I feel like it's getting too light, I can go back to my palette and put some more paint on my brush and continue to add some more color. I think though this is as dark as I want it to get towards the middle, so I'm going to just add water to the very bottom layer so it's a very, very pale pink, and then gradually move back up left to right and blend it together. So you could do a wash with more than one color. You could let it dry and layer another color over top of it, and that would give a different effect as well. But for now, I'm just going to leave that with one color and let it dry and move on to my second technique. The second technique is dry brush. With a dry brush, you're going to start with obviously a dry brush, and you're also going to start with almost dry paint. So I've only put 1 or 2 drops in the palette, and then you're going to paint wet watercolor, or sorry, you're going to run your brush over your paper, and it's going to create texture that looks like grass or scratchy lines. So I'm going to use just a little bit of green, and again, I haven't put a whole lot of water on this, so when I put this brush stroke on the paper, you can see that the white through the paper is coming through. It's not a solid color. And then I'm going to go back into my palette again, and this was a little bit darker because there was even less water. And I'll just show you my palette that I'm working with right here. This is the green that I'm using, and it's almost completely dry right now. I'm going to put a little bit more color on my brush, and you can see that those lines are even darker. So this gives a very textured feeling. If I added another drop of water into my palette, that's starting to get really wet, so I'm going to actually dry that off. I have a sponge here, or if you have a paper towel, you could dry it off on a paper towel, because I don't even want that much water. There's no puddle in my well, it's pretty much absorbed in, but I'm still getting that dry brush look where it's textured. And I think for this one, I'm going to clean off my brush, and I will layer another color on top of that. So I'm going to use this yellow because that's pretty dry, and that will mix well with the green, I think. So if I was trying to do something to look like grass, this would be a great technique because it's very textured looking, and then when I layer those 2 colors, I can still see the green underneath, and then the green and the yellow are starting to mix a little bit and create another value of that green. So that is the dry brush technique. The third technique is with salt. So you just need to grab a little bit of table salt. If you have it in your house, you could use, if you already have it in a salt shaker, grab that. If you do not have salt in your house, that is okay. For this technique, what I would like you to do is practice one of the other 2 that we just did. So use different colors, different combinations, or you could even do a combination of the 2 and do a wash and layer a dry brush over top of it. So otherwise, we're going to use our salt to create texture in our paint. So we're going to do a wash of color on our paper first, and again, it doesn't matter what color you use. I'm going to use a little bit of a darker color for this one because I want you to be able to see the effect that the salt has. I also want the paint to be pretty dark, so I'm not using a ton of water. So you want to make sure that you're working pretty fast to get your square painted, because when we sprinkle the salt on top of the watercolor paint, we want to make sure that the square is still wet. So you can see how my paper is still shiny. That's how I know it is still wet, or if you really can't tell, if your lighting doesn't show if it's shiny or not, you can always just stick your finger in it too and see, make sure that it's still wet. So I'm going to just put a little bit of salt into my palm and then sprinkle it onto the wet paint. So you might want to do a little bit more in some areas and then have a little bit less in some, just to see what it looks like. I think I'm going to put a little bit more on here. And depending on how wet your paper is, you might not notice anything happen right away, but we're going to just let that sit and dry. And then when we get to the end of our 6 boxes, we'll come back and we'll wipe off the salt and see what happened. So while you wait for your paper to dry, you are going to label each of these techniques in your sketchbook. So when it's dry, you'll cut out that square and glue it or tape it onto one of your pages. And what you're going to do right now is write down the technique and also a few notes on how you created that. So these definitions are posted for you on our Schoology page. It is in the file that is labeled Basic Watercolor Techniques. So you can open that up and download it onto your computer, and then you can just write the description that is on that handout. So for example, the first one is wash, and for that you load your brush with plenty of wet paint, smooth your brush over the paper with swooping strokes. And it's just a note for you to remember how you created that technique. So you're gonna do one on each page, and the first 3 that we did today are wash, dry brush, and then salt. So you're going to write those 3 into your sketchbook along with the description, and then you'll do the same thing for the other 3 when those are dry and finished.